Debate. The Honourable Member for York South Weston.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased to speak on what is an excellent motion from the member for Nanaimo Cowichan. My riding does not have a reserve in it, but there are First Nations peoples in my riding, and I have met with them and I have talked to them, and in fact, one of them, a couple of them, put on a Remembrance Day ceremony, a sunrise ceremony this past November, to honor First Nations soldiers who have fought for Canada in wars overseas, and to remind the children. It was at a school. It was at an ordinary school in my riding, Bala Avenue Junior Public School, and to remind the children of those schools that it isn't that everybody is in this, that we are all together. And it was a moving and wonderful ceremony. Another constituent has asked me on several occasions about whether or not it would be possible to create a native language immersion school in Toronto, because there are 10,000 native children in Toronto who need an education. And we can manage to have immersion schools all over the place for the French language as one of the nation-to-nation languages in this country. But we cannot seem to put together the wherewithal to build a language education for First Nations children. Now, I discovered as a result of investigation that there is such native language schools in the reserve at Six Nations. And they teach their kids Mohawk and Cayuga in an immersion setting from junior kindergarten all the way up to grade 8. And it's wonderful. And I'll talk more about that later. Because it was clear it's clear now from this issue coming forward, and from the events in Southern Ontario and all over Canada, that the whole issue of the relationship between the government and First Nations, mostly about money, but also about land claims, has proven to many First Nations people across this country that there is a deficit, there is a problem, and there are people talking about whether or not it is discriminatory on the part of this government to provide less for First Nations people than they provide for others, whether it is discriminatory on the part of this government to not fund education the way they should. There is a grassroots, the Isle No More protest has created a grassroots manifestation of the frustration that has gone on for many, many years in these First Nations communities. And I'm talking dozens and dozens of years since the first obligations of the treaties started to become clear that the governments weren't going to honor some of those treaties. And it's not just the treaties, but it's the care and control of the government of the First Nations people that has failed. They have been paternalistic, they have been punishing, and they have been prejudiced in their behavior towards First Nations people. And more recently, this government is showing its paternalistic and punishing nature with the acts that it has brought forward to force First Nations to report all the money they take in and earn in a new way, in a different way, because somebody somewhere said they didn't like the way it was being done. It's paternalistic and it's punishing, and that needs to stop. And there are some that would suggest that there is a sense of disregard, of disdain for Native issues in some of the Conservative caucus. And the events this week of the member from Ottawa Orleans and Senator Brazo in a fundraiser showed some of the potential for contempt that we are hearing. And I hope and pray that it is not widespread amongst the Conservative caucus, but there are those out there who fear that it is. So with that context, on the Six Nations Reserve, I went to visit the Six Nations Reserve as a result of my quest to see if we can't create a native language school, and discovered when I was there just how hard it is to educate children on this reserve, whether it's in First Native languages or not. It is extremely difficult. They told me that they receive about half the money from the federal government that the provincial government provides to teach children off reserve. So it's roughly $10,000 per child that the provincial government gives, and the federal government, according to the Band Council on the Reserve, it's around $5,000 per child. Now, when they question this, the government says, well, you can pay your teachers less, because those that are living on reserve don't pay taxes. So that means that limits the teachers that they can get to those on reserve. It's just, it's a sense of paternalism. It gets worse, though. When they created this native language school, they did it independent, not completely independent of the federal government, but as an adjunct to the federal government. And they did it with fees from the parents. So it's like a private school, in that the parents have to pay to send their children to this school. But small business people in the community have decided to contribute, to donate space to that school. So what did the federal government do when they discovered that there had been space donated to this school? They deducted the value of the space from the contributions they made on behalf of the children to that school.
That's a shame.
They clawed back a donation. Imagine, if you will, any school board in this country that tried to do the same thing. That your kids are out there selling chocolate-covered almonds to raise money for a trip, and the school board says, oh, if you raise money, if there's a donation to the school, we're going to claw it back. It would be unheard of. It wouldn't ever happen. But there on the Six Nation Reserve is exactly what goes on. And it is shameful that that kind of attitude takes place. It is shameful that the Six Nations Reserve cannot, with full funding from the federal government, provide for whatever kind of education they want to provide. The Six Nations Reserve is in southern Ontario. It's in the breadbasket of Canada, if you will, and yet there are 325 homes without running water. How did that happen? How is it that we have a lack of running water on homes in southern Ontario, only on a reserve? Well, 14 months ago, when the member from Kootenay, Columbia was up speaking on First Nations issues, I asked him, what about this 325 homes? He said, Mr. Speaker, we will ensure and work towards making sure those people at Six Nations get drinking water to those 325 homes. The infrastructure that is required to be placed into those homes has to be done through whatever means is required, putting pipes in the ground, ensuring they get to their homes, ensuring they're hooked up to the water system, ensuring they're hooked up to the wastewater system. I am confident that this will occur very quickly. It's unfortunate it's taken so long, but I can assure the House that our committee and the Minister will ensure that it happens sooner than later. Nothing's happened. That was 14 months ago. That's typical of the government of the day. It is a priority for us. I hear them say over and over and over again in answer to questions, it's a priority. But it doesn't get done because it's not really a priority. It wasn't in the budget. It's not in the plans. It's not in the priorities of the government. But they can sit there and say it's a priority, and we will. But they don't actually do it. It boils down to money. It really boils down to money. The other big problem at the Six Nations Reserve is the land claims issue. It has been festering for many years, and in Ontario, in Caledonia, we saw the manifestation of frustration of the land claims issue in 2006 when a group of Native protesters took over a housing construction project and occupied it and prevented houses being built because they claimed that that land was disputed. And that issue still is festering. That was 2006. That was 7 years ago. And it's still there. It's not just 7 years. There are dozens and dozens of years that these Native groups and First Nations communities have been saying over and over again that their land claims have not been respected by governments, not just the Conservative government, Liberal governments before them. So that needs to be done on a nation-to-nation basis. But what also needs to be done from this government is a real commitment to dollars. The Liberal government froze the funding for First Nations activities like education at 2%. This government hasn't changed it. They found enough money to increase the budget for the Ministry of Defense by 44%, but they can only find 2% for First Nations. There's something wrong with the priorities of this government, and we want to change those priorities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for York South-Weston for his speech. I think if he looks at the record of this government since 2006, he'll see much greater increases in financial commitment to First Nations. And I'd ask him simply, as part of this debate, if he would acknowledge, as some of his colleagues have quite frankly not done, some of the achievements that have been made by First Nations in their communities thanks to federal government funding. 10,000 new homes built and many thousands of new homes renovated. Increased funding for child and family services by 25%. Not to mention, Mr. Speaker, the skills issue, 700 projects, not single individual initiatives, but projects for whole communities and whole classes of young people, linking Aboriginals across Canada with job training and counselling services. Not to mention, Mr. Speaker, 400 land claims that have been concluded since 2006. Would the member opposite acknowledge this as progress, significant, substantial progress? Yes, progress that we need to multiply. And would he agree that it's not simply a question of dollars, that without accountability?
Order. Order. The Honourable Member for York South-Weston.
What the member opposite has reminded us is that there has been some tinkering, yes, by this government, but tinkering is not what is necessary. What is necessary is a 44% increase, like the Ministry of Defence, the ministry that he is purportedly representing, which was received over the term of office of this Conservative government, is not what the Native Affairs Department has received, is not what Natives in Canada have received. They have received some tinkering around the edges. If you build 10,000 houses, that's part of the regular process, but you need to build 80,000 houses, there's something wrong with this message. If there are 427 students on that reserve who can't get a post-secondary education because the money's not there, they're waiting, there's something wrong with that picture.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, whether it's today's leader of the Liberal Party or former leader, Prime Minister Paul Martin, the Liberal Party believes there needs to be a comprehensive approach at dealing with our First Nations and Aboriginals. Mr. Speaker, former Canadian Assembly of First Nations Chief Phil Fontaine has argued repeatedly for the implementation of the Kelowna Accord. He had called the deal a breakthrough for his people. This isn't something as his former member, the Speaker's former colleague, indicated that the Liberals did it on the deathbed. Well, here, former Prime Minister Paul Martin was halfway through a 4-year term when there was 18 months of roundtables and consultations which led to the Kelowna Accord. But because the NDP were eager to vote with the Conservatives to cause an election, the Kelowna Accord died. That is the reality. The issue and the question I have for the member is, does he have any remorse or regret, or will he at the very least acknowledge that we need another comprehensive accord that's going to deal with our First Nation issues today?
The Honourable Member for York South-Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Deathbed conventions are not what is needed here. Or conversions, I guess. The Liberal government had 13 years of majority rule, and only in the last year did they come up with something. Only in the last year did they actually put their minds to something, and that's what the problem is. Now we have that same Liberal government was the one who froze the amount of money that was flowing to the First Nations people, and that freezing has continued to this day. And yet, as I said, there are 427 kids on that reserve who can't get post-secondary education because they've run out of money. Thank you.
Resume